So welcome to part 2 of our video lectures on commas. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about these pesky little punctuation marks and some of the things that they do. One of the things that commas do is separate a dependent clause from an independent clause when it comes before the independent clause. Another way of looking at it is that the comma separates information that introduces the main primary independent clause from the independent clause itself. An example might be if you're going to use a comma, make sure you have a independent clause. Well, make sure you have an independent clause is the main independent clause. If you're going to use a comma, introduces that, provides more information about it. So it's separated from the thing that it's providing more information about with a comma. So this is called a complex sentence. And a complex sentence contains at least one independent clause and at least one dependent clause. We talked about these in the sentence basics. Dependent clauses can refer to the subject, sequence of time, or casual elements of the independent clause, but they always provide more information about the independent clause. If a sentence begins with a dependent clause, you put a comma after the clause. If the sentence begins with an independent clause, you do not place a comma separating the two clauses. So it only applies if the introductory information comes before the independent clause. So here's some examples. So your dependent clause is in blue. Although she completed her literature review, comma, she still needed to work on her methods section. So you can see that this, although she completed her literature review, is a dependent clause. It has a subject and a verb, but it does not form a complete thought on its own. You can't just have, although she completed her literature review, as a sentence. It doesn't pass the I know that test. I know that although she completed her literature review, we don't know. And then we also have an independent clause, our main independent clause, which is she still needed to work on her methods section. And we have a subject and a verb, and it does form a complete thought. The dependent clause comes before the independent clause, so you put the comma right here in between them. Same thing here. Because he organized his sources by theme, that's a dependent clause, it was easier for his readers to follow. That's your main independent clause. And because the dependent clause comes before the independent clause, we have a comma here. Here we have a situation where the dependent clause comes after the independent clause. They studied APA rules for many hours as they were so interesting. You'll note that when the dependent clause comes after the independent clause, there is no comma. There's a complicated rule for this. We're not going to go into why that rule exists. Just know that if the dependent clause comes before, you need the comma. If the dependent clause comes after, you don't need the comma. Commas also separate two independent clauses that are joined by coordinating conjunctions, which I refer to often as the fanboys, because they spell fanboys. For, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. If you have two independent clauses that are separated by one of those 7 words, you need a comma before the coordinating conjunction, before the fanboy. If you have two independent clauses that are separated by basically any other word, you do not need a comma. This is called a compound sentence. It contains at least 2 independent clauses, and they are combined with a comma and a coordinating conjunction. You can also use a semicolon instead of both the comma and the coordinating conjunction. You could also use a period as well. But then it wouldn't be a compound sentence. It would be 2 independent clauses, 2 sentences. So she completed her literature review. That is an independent clause. It makes sense on its own, has a subject and a verb, comma, and she created her reference list. She created her reference list, subject, verb, complete thought. It's an independent clause. You have the word and in between them, so you need the comma before the and. Same thing with the third one. They studied APA rules for many hours. Independent clause. They realized there was still much to learn. Independent clause. Word but's in between them, so we need a comma before the but. And you'll notice in the middle one that you have a very similar situation, but instead of the comma and the coordinating conjunction, you just have a semicolon. He organized his sources by theme, semicolon, then he updated his reference list. I would say be careful using semicolons because they have to be closely related ideas for it to work. I would not use them until you've really got your commas mastered. So commas also indicate information that interrupts an independent clause. So if you have extra information that tells you more about the independent clause, but is not part of the independent clause proper, then you separate it from the independent clause by commas. And because it's kind of coming in the middle, you need a comma on both sides of it to show the start and stop of the interrupting information. So your teacher, comma, Miss Companion, comma, is creating this presentation. The independent clause there is your teacher is creating this presentation. My name is extra information, so we separate it from the main clause with commas. It can also indicate additional information that may be helpful but is not essential. So, example, there are many comma rules, comma, such as the ones we'll discuss in this presentation. There are many comma rules is your independent clause, such as the ones we'll discuss in this presentation is additional information that tells you more about the comma rules themselves. Now, you'll notice that this is not a dependent clause. If it was a dependent clause, we wouldn't need that comma there. And I know that's a really tricky point, and I know that gets really confusing. It's a bit of trial and error, and we'll work together on that. So now let's go into a little bit more detail about the I know that test. This is my favorite way, and I still use it today sometimes, for testing whether or not I have independent clauses, which in turn tells me whether or not I need a comma in, for instance, a compound sentence or after a dependent clause. It's a lot easier than trying to say, okay, well, where's that subject? Where's that verb? So, okay, if you put the words I know that before any independent clause, it will make sense. In this case, my cat happened to be crying when I was making this presentation. So I know that my cat is crying. Well, here's the I know that. This makes sense. So my cat is crying is an independent clause. If you put it before anything else, it won't make sense. I know that because she is mad at me. Well, I don't know who's mad at me in this sentence. I don't know why they're mad at me. I don't know what they're doing. So we're really missing a lot of information here. I know that on the shelf. I don't know who is on the shelf or what it's doing there, so that doesn't make sense. I know that dogs. Dogs what? So none of these would pass the I know that test because they are not independent thoughts. They are not an independent clause. This is an independent clause. If you're curious about why it works, I know is an independent clause. That is a subordinating conjunction. It actually links it to the independent clause, and you have to have an independent clause on either side of that. So exceptions. I know that test works in all situations but two. It does not work with questions, and it does not work with commands. Because as we talked about in the sentence basics PowerPoint, those two types of sentences mess with the subjects and the verbs. They don't occur in the right order, and so the I know that test doesn't work. But it does work in 99.9% of cases that you'll see, and it's a great way for figuring out whether or not you need a comma. Especially with the most common errors, which have to do with not correctly punctuating compound sentences. So how can you use it? So to figure out your main independent clause in a sentence, you can use it to figure out your main independent clause in a sentence. So the sentence, when she gets up in the morning, my cat likes to eat because she's hungry. So we just go through the different parts of the sentence to test for it. I know that when she gets up in the morning. That doesn't pass. I know that my cat likes to eat. That passes. Because she is hungry. I know that because she is hungry. That doesn't pass. So we know that our main independent clause here is my cat likes to eat. We know that when she gets up in the morning comes before, so it needs a comma. And we know that because she is after comes after, so it doesn't need a comma. So we end up with the correctly punctuated sentence. When she gets up in the morning, my cat likes to eat because she is hungry. You can also use the I know that test to determine if you have a sentence or a fragment. A sentence will pass. A fragment will not. You can determine if and where you need to place your commas. So if you can figure out that independent clause and you can figure out what your dependent clauses are using the I know that test, then you can figure out where you need to place commas for introductory elements or dependent clauses, or for non-essential elements, which are those things that break up the flow of an independent clause where you put commas on both sides. So let me look at the time here. Okay, we're going to stop this one here. And then we're going to talk about the big five, which are the 5 most common writing errors, and you'll have seen me reference a few of them in your essays and your paragraphs thus far. So I'm going to come back in just a moment and we'll go into some more detail on that. So be right back.